So in this series of talks where I focus upon how to avoid disappointment on the spiritual path, I think the next step to talk about here is that one of the major sources of disappointment for spiritual people is other people. And it has a lot to do with the dynamic that we start out with. I've said it before, we grow up in these modern societies where you have on one side you have a religion, often Christianity, on the other side you have materialism that says there's nothing spiritual, and we don't fit in either camp. So we feel like we are outcasts. And often we are, ridiculed for our beliefs, or we feel that we can't express ourselves freely, we can't ask the questions that are important to us because nobody wants to hear them. I met so many spiritual people over the years who grew up in a Catholic environment, and when they would ask the priest certain questions, the standard answer would be, "It's a mystery, my child." And that didn't really help them whatsoever. And of course, if you ask certain questions of materialists, for example, teachers in school, you'll basically be told that it's a stupid question because there is nothing beyond the material world. So we often grow up feeling that we are ignored, we are put down, we are bullied into submission or into silence. And so it's natural that when we find a spiritual movement, we are thinking, perhaps not consciously, but that's the reaction. All right, here are other people like me who are spiritual. I can be myself, I can speak freely. And in some cases that's true, at least especially for a time. But what often happens is that every spiritual movement I've ever come across, it has a certain culture, certain organizational culture. And many spiritual movements are centered around one person, a guru. And this is a typical pattern, a spiritual movement is started by some guru. And it's often looked at in the movement that this guru has some authority or status. He or she has reached some higher level of consciousness. And it's somewhat comparable to experts in society or dictators who are infallible. So there's often this assumption that the guru knows everything and the guru is always right and the guru's teaching is infallible. And so this means that the guru is supposed to be able to answer all of your questions. And if you have a question that the guru can't answer, it's not that there's something wrong with the guru, no, there's something wrong with you, or at least with your question. So after an initial honeymoon period in a spiritual organization, you often end up that you suddenly realize there are certain questions you can't answer. You can't ask, because if the guru can't answer them, you shouldn't be asking a question. And so you get a negative reaction from other people. And so you either accept this and you submit, or you reject it and you leave. So there's a certain, what I call unnatural selection in spiritual movements. That is that those who stay in a movement, they are accepting the culture. These are the boundaries of what I can ask and what I can't ask. I'm not necessarily saying there's something so wrong with that. If you join some kind of organization in the world, they also have certain parameters and boundaries. But what I'm trying to say is that after initially feeling like you are accepted for who you are and you are free to ask any questions, there often in a spiritual movement comes this, you realize there are certain boundaries and other people will then give you a negative reaction. So this can be one thing that gives you a certain disappointment. But often there are other things that come in that play into this or reinforce it. And here's another assumption we often have when we come into a spiritual movement. We have, during our life, been exposed to people who were, what should we call it? Difficult, aggressive, perhaps even evil. Directly trying to manipulate us, to control us. they were, quite frankly, to be blunt, assholes. Or at least they were acting like it. And so here so it's very easy when you find a spiritual movement to go into this. But the people I met in the world, they were assholes because they were not spiritual. They didn't have this spiritual understanding. They didn't know about karma, for example, that you make karma when you are mean to other people. But here is the spiritual movement. Everybody is now spiritual. They know you make karma if you're mean to other people. So nobody's mean to anybody. And so the underlying assumption is that now that I've stepped into this wonderful spiritual movement, I'm never going to meet an asshole in here. Because people are just so wonderful and spiritual. And then you get into the spiritual movement, and after a time, you meet somebody who's just like the other assholes you met out there. And you're confused because how can this happen? And sometimes you try to find various excuses. And I remember in my first spiritual movement, meditation movement, the idea was that you were meditating, you were going into this deep relaxation, and this would touch upon these stresses you had in your subconscious mind, and it would release them. And when they were released, you could be colored by it, and therefore people could be unstressing. So if somebody was mean to you, you might say, oh, he's just unstressing. It'll be over in a while. But you still experience, there are some people, it's not over in a while. It wasn't a temporary thing. They are just mean people. And then what you start realizing is that these mean people you meet in a spiritual movement, they're in a sense worse than the mean people you met outside the spiritual movement, because inside the spiritual movement, they are not seeing that they are mean. They have an excuse for being the way they are. And it's an excuse based on the culture and the teachings of the spiritual movement. In my second spiritual movement, which even knew about ascended masters, there was this culture that you had, in order to make it on the spiritual path, you had to be very disciplined, very focused. You had to be what they call blue ray, because we were talking about spiritual rays, and the first ray was the blue ray of will and determination. So you had to be very determined to make it. And there was a concept that there were people who were more mature in the movement. They had been there longer. Sometimes they had achieved some status in the organization, some position, working for the organization. And it was their job to discipline those who were new. And sometimes they would do this by blue raining, which means they would talk to them in this very strict and determined voice. Your ego is acting up and you shouldn't be doing this. You know, they were often worse than I'm doing here. But anyway, so there was an excuse for being mean. And this is what you see in some spiritual movements. And I understand it. There are certain dynamics for how you have to run a spiritual movement, right? A spiritual movement, and this is where we sometimes, when we come into a movement, we have a toxic expectation. Because we think that, oh, a spiritual movement, we should all be so kind and we should tolerate everything. But you can't have an organization without having certain parameters, certain rules, certain guidelines, certain things you do and don't do. You really can't. How is it an organization? So, in order to make an organization function, over time, have some continuity, you have to have certain rules. I mean, this is what we do in this organization. If you don't like it, then you have to go somewhere else. I mean, if you join a club where they're riding bicycles and you want to bring a motorbike, you're in the wrong club. You join a bikers club. You can't have everything. So I understand there has to be rules. So there has to be somebody who enforces the rules, right? If you have an organization where they have activities, things have to be organized. There has to be an AV system. There has to be chairs to sit on. There has to be meals. They have to be cooked and this and that. So I understand that there are people who have to take positions of responsibility for getting things to work. But what I'm saying is, what often happens is that we have, again, what I call an unnatural selection. Because often, a spiritual movement, especially when it's small, it's relying on volunteers. So somebody has to come in and say, okay, I'm willing to do this job. But often the people who select themselves for a certain job are people who enjoy bossing other people around. In other words, they have a power issue or a control issue. And this is what you see in many, many spiritual movements. You have the guru who's up there on the top, and when an organization gets to a certain size, everybody can't have access to the guru because he only has 24 hours a day. So there comes this middle layer, middle management layer, that are basically, in some ways, filtering out who has access to the guru. But it also puts them in a very specific position. They have access to the guru, but those below them don't. So if there's a conflict, who's going to be right? Well, the middle manager, because the middle manager can say, well, this is how the guru wants it done. Or the middle manager can say, I talked to the guru about this and he said this is where it's going to be. And how are you going to object to that? But more than that, as I said in my second spiritual movement, there was this culture of this blue-raying people, that there were certain middle managers that literally saw that they were like the replacement guru or the mini guru for those below them, for disciplining them and giving them their tests and this and that. So they were going around, blue-raying people and being, quite frankly, just being mean to them. And the problem is that those below them, they have no recourse. There's nowhere you can go. You can't go directly to the guru. And these people, who are in a certain position in an organization, they won't respect anybody else but the guru. Because they think there's the guru here and they are just right below the guru, and then there's everybody else who's at lower levels. So what I'm saying is that in many spiritual organizations, you have this hierarchy that starts emerging. Those who have access to the guru and the special class, they are the upper class, the superior class, the rulers. And then there are various levels below, but at the bottom is the ordinary members who just come into the organization. And so what I'm saying is, what happens to a lot of people is, you come into the spiritual movement, you think everybody's going to be nice and kind, and we're all going to get along because we all have the same spiritual teaching and the same spiritual outlook. But then you realize, there's a person. Why is he on my case? Why is she always criticizing me? Why are they trying to be mean to me? I'm just here to do something. I'm volunteering. I want to help. I want to do things. But why do I have to be treated like I'm some second-rate person, or I'm potentially some rebellious person who doesn't want to do what I'm being asked to do? Or why are people just mean? Then there can be another consideration that comes in, and that is that you meet other people who are part of the spiritual movement. And you are expecting them, because they're in a spiritual movement, to be honest. And not try to cheat you out of your money. Or not try to manipulate you to do something for them. And you find, in a large spiritual movement, you're going to find a few people who are there just to take advantage of others. I remember, I was in my second spiritual movement in the 80s, and then in 89, 90, in their headquarters in Montana, they built these bomb shelters to prepare for a possible nuclear war. And that meant everybody spent a lot of money, all the money they had, on these bomb shelters. And so after this cycle was over, everybody was hurting for money. And every multi-level marketing scheme known to man came into town. And there were people who came into town with all these harebrained schemes for how you could make quick and easy money. And I see this in other spiritual movements as well. I lived for 5 years in Utah, where the Mormon church has its headquarters. And again, every multi-level marketing scheme and every other get-rich-quick scheme was there. Because in spiritual movements, you often have this idea that, oh, money is just a necessary evil, so the easiest and quickest way you can make money possible is good. And so people are looking for an easy way to make money so you can focus on your spiritual activities. And so here comes somebody who says, oh yeah, this multi-level marketing scheme. You just spend a couple of hours a week and you make thousands of dollars. But of course it doesn't work. It never works, okay? At least I haven't seen it work. And so I know there are some people who will say, yeah, it works for me, this is great. This multi-level marketing is better than all the others. That's fine. But So I'm just saying, you can run into people who are directly there to cheat others. No, they're just there to take advantage of it because they have realized that if they go into a spiritual organization and pretend like they are members of the organization, the other members are going to believe they are trustworthy because they're in the organization. And the same thing, it's not just money making, it can be other things as well. You know, where there are some people that are just, even trying to have a relationship, a personal sexual relationship with somebody based on, oh, we are both spiritual, right? And there are some spiritual movements where this is really, really dysfunctional, you know, where people feel obligated to have a spiritual relationship with people who want to have sex with them, especially women. You know, are often, manipulated into feeling like they should be accommodating and they should be nice and this and that. And so there's a lot of things where people can take advantage of others by using the spiritual teaching that you're supposed to be open, you're supposed to be kind and loving and trusting. You're supposed to be so loving, right? And so you just see this in spiritual movements. And don't get me wrong here. I have been in spiritual movements. I'm still a spiritual person after 48 years. I have seen certain things, but I haven't become disappointed, and I haven't left all spirituality behind. So my goal here is not to put down spiritual movements. It's actually to help you see that you cannot let other people derail your spiritual growth. And this is something that has carried me through these organizations I've been involved with, because I've also been exposed to people who, okay, they were just assholes, okay? And they talked a good game, and they knew how to say all the right things. But they were just assholes, wolves in sheep's clothing, to use a biblical expression. And but the reason why I never got derailed by it, I never got so disappointed I had to leave, was that I always had this in the back of my mind, that I'm responsible for my spiritual growth, and I can't let other people stand between me and my growth. And then when I found Ascended Master teachings, I realized that the Ascended Masters are completely beyond all of this human nonsense. That's to me, one of the greatest advantages of having the Ascended Masters as your spiritual teachers. They are beyond any of this human dynamic. And therefore, I can't let any human being stand between me and my personal relationship with the Ascended Masters. And that means no matter what people have done to me, no matter how mean, how controlling, how abusive they've been, it never caused me to flip and say, that's it, I'm done with spirituality. And I hope other people can grasp this and see the importance of this, and maybe even reevaluate if you have gone through this, being disappointed and left the spiritual movement. Because it is possible to be in a spiritual movement. It is possible to be spiritual without going through this negative dynamic. But in order to do it, you have to also be willing to look at yourself and say, why am I reacting to people this way? And why am I actually expecting that people should be all nice and loving in the spiritual movement? And I know this is an enigma. It's really tough to deal with. I remember going through several years I was dealing with this, because on the one hand you can say, you find a spiritual movement and you are expecting that the members of that movement are going to live up to the spiritual teaching. For example, most spiritual movements talk about karma. And if you're cheating other people or lying to them or manipulating them, you're making karma. And so you are expecting that if people believe in karma, they are not going to lie to you and cheat you and manipulate you. And it's a very reasonable expectation. I mean, ideally, you should be able, in a spiritual movement, to feel safe, to feel secure. You should not be taken advantage of. You should not be bullied into submission. All of these things. But the way I resolved this, and so I said the enigma is you have a reasonable expectation, but it's just not matched by reality. And the way I resolved this enigma was to realize that most people in spiritual movements are not doing manipulative or things to you deliberately. They're not even realizing what they're doing because of their psychology. They have a certain unresolved psychology. And as I said, they have actually used the spiritual teaching to justify what they're doing, to explain it away as it's okay. And this is clearly, it's unresolved psychology is dysfunctional. But I came to the realization that, but am I completely without unresolved psychology? And I realized I'm not. I have my own psychology that causes me to treat other people a certain way. And even if it isn't, lying and cheating and taking advantage of people, we all have unresolved psychology. So I realized that, I remember still coming to my second spiritual movement, moving from Denmark to Montana and coming into this big spiritual organization with thousands of members, and it was very overwhelming. And I saw that people were not as nice. It took me 2 days to realize people were not as nice as I had imagined they would be. And so I was thinking about this, and what came to me was, but listen, did you see when you entered the gate that there was a trash can saying, leave your ego here? Was there that trash can? And I realized there wasn't. So that meant what? That meant I didn't leave my ego in the trash can. I brought it with me. And so did everybody else. So what was I expecting? Was I expecting that just by walking through the door, you became the perfect human being? It just isn't realistic. So all I'm saying again is this. It's not a matter, and this is one of the dysfunctional things in spiritual movements, is that you find excuses for people treating you in a way they shouldn't treat you. So you don't speak out about it. You just say, oh, I just have to be kind and spiritual. I just have to take it. And this is what often builds tension, which then leads to the point where you break and now you can't handle it anymore, so you think you have to leave. So it's not a matter of blindly accepting how you're treated. But on the other hand, it is a matter of saying, I'm here for spiritual growth, and I am not going to let somebody else's ego prevent me from growing. I'm not going to let somebody else's ego prevent me from overcoming my own ego. Because this is what happens. You have to recognize one very simple dynamic. In any spiritual movement, but especially the more valid ones who have a deeper teaching, what is the purpose of you being in a spiritual movement? It is actually you overcome your ego. And how are you going to overcome your ego? Well, you have to see it. And how are you going to come to see it? Because the feature of the ego, as I explained in my talks about the ego, is that it creates this veil of illusion. We don't see it. So how are you going to come to see your ego? By interacting with other people. When they push your buttons and you react a certain way, you have an opportunity to see, oh, that's my ego causing me to react this way. And then if you are willing to look at yourself, look at the beam in your own eye, you can overcome that aspect of that separate self, as I call it, and you are making progress on your path. So you could say that the purpose of a spiritual organization, at least one of the purposes, is actually to put people together so they push each other's buttons. And that gives everybody an opportunity to look at the beam, the button, in their own eye. And now you're going to say, because I said the same thing, but these people are still mean. These middle managers, they're still mean. And why should they be doing this? They shouldn't be abusing their authority. And that may be perfectly true. And it may be that there are times where it is appropriate to speak out about it. I once, I asked a couple of times, spoke out about this. But I did it in an obsessive-compulsive way, because I hadn't looked at my own psychology first before I did it. So what I'm saying is, you can shift your approach to spiritual movements. Instead of thinking, I'm stepping into paradise, you realize, I am stepping into a situation where it's likely that my buttons are going to be pushed much more than they were out there in ordinary life. And this is my opportunity. This is actually why I'm here. And that's why you can say, okay, at a certain level, it really doesn't matter to me that this person is mean. And whether that person looks at his or her own psychology and does something about it really doesn't matter to me. Because why am I here? I'm here for my growth. I'm not here to get other people to grow. I'm here for my personal growth. And so when somebody does something, creates a reaction in me, this is my opportunity to look at my reaction. And if I look at that and resolve it, then I have grown. And perhaps when I have overcome my own reaction, I'll have a more neutral way of looking at the situation. Perhaps I can speak out. And perhaps I can't. Because there isn't an opportunity. In many spiritual movements, there isn't that feedback mechanism. There is no two-way communication. It's all from top down, which is actually one of the unfortunate things about spiritual movements. But again, that's a different topic. So, so all I'm trying to say with this, I feel I'm going a little bit off on a tangent, but what I'm trying to say with this is, you can't let anybody else's ego stop or delay your spiritual growth. And the only way to avoid that is that you stop projecting out that the problem is out there, and you look at what is my problem in this situation, regardless of what the other person is doing. It may very well be that what the other person is doing isn't right. But what is my problem in the situation? My problem is not the other person. My problem is my reaction to it. And if you take responsibility for your reaction, then you will make progress. And it may be that after you overcome your reactionary pattern, you gain a different perspective on your involvement with the spiritual organization. You become more neutral. I can look back and I can see that I had some tense situations in both my first and second spiritual movement. And I can see I was obsessed about it. I was obsessive compulsive about it. I felt like something had to be done and I had to speak out about this. And I did it in an unbalanced way, which of course got an unbalanced reaction from other people. It wasn't constructive for me. It didn't help me. It didn't help the situation either. So what I can see is that after I looked at my own psychology, I can now look back at these situations and look more neutrally. And I can see two things. First of all, in the situations where I spoke out, I could have spoken out in a more neutral way. And potentially I would have gotten a better reaction. Maybe. But I can also see there are some situations where no matter what I would have said, it wouldn't have made any difference because the people were closed. The people who had a certain position of authority didn't want to hear anything that contradicted the way they wanted to do things. And there wasn't a feedback loop in the organization where I could say this. And today, I would have just not said anything. So what I'm saying is that there comes a point where you can say, okay, this doesn't bother me anymore. Is there a possibility to change it by speaking out? And you say, no, there isn't. Or if there is, then you speak out, but you are not attached to it. But if there isn't, then you can say, okay, can I live with it? Can I live with the way things are and not be bothered by it so I can stay in the movement? And do I see that my goal for staying in the movement is more important to me than this particular situation? And then it's like you can shift and you can say, okay, well, this is the way this organizational culture is. I accept that for what it is. And I can live with it. Or you can say, I can't live with it. I don't want to live with it. Why should I live with it? So I'm out of here. But you are leaving in a neutral way. You're not leaving, as I've seen many people do, by becoming disappointed. And now, as I've said in another video, in order to justify leaving, you're projecting that, oh, it's everybody else's fault. It's the guru, it's the organization, it's these people, it's that supervisor, it's this and that. As long as you're blaming others, it shows there's some subconscious self you haven't seen in yourself. Because projecting out and blaming others always comes from a subconscious self. So if you can get past that, you might leave and you might say, okay, well, I learned everything I needed to learn from this organization. I had the growth out of it I needed to have. And so now if you have managed to listen to this long talk here, if you can look back at your life and say, okay, I see exactly, I did the same thing that Kim is describing, that he did. I got obsessive compulsive about a situation, a conflict with other people, and I left. What do I do now? Well, as I said, it's never too late. You look back and you say, okay, can I look at my psychology, my reactionary pattern? Can I discover why I reacted that way and why I probably reacted to other situations, perhaps even on my job or with family members, the same way? Can I look at this and say, okay, it's time to get over it? And if you can, it wasn't wasted to be in that spiritual organization. You have learned the lesson you were meant to learn. And so, you know, maybe this is beyond the topic, but still, what is the biggest source of disappointment in spiritual movements? It's basically personality conflicts. Clashes between different personalities. Some people don't like that person, don't like what that person is doing. And so you get yourself into these situations. And, you know, there can be various ways to look at it. I mean, the one way to look at it is, as I said, we all have our individual psychology. We take it with us when we come into a spiritual movement. And the greater purpose of a spiritual movement is actually to help us work through it by pushing our buttons. People in a spiritual movement push each other's buttons. They, of course, do that in normal life also, but especially in spiritual movements because they often feel that they're trapped there. You know, once you enter a movement, it's like you can't easily leave because you lose the status you got by entering, and you feel like you have to be there because you have to help the world and you have to make spiritual progress and this and that. So you feel in this, it's like you put people in a confined space, they're more likely to have conflict than if they're in a bigger space where they can avoid each other. So here you can't avoid each other. So you see a lot of these personality clashes. And quite frankly, a lot, I have over the many years I've been involved with spiritual movements, I've seen this over and over again. Petty personal conflicts. And I say petty because they are petty. Because they come from these subconscious selves that cause us to react a certain way. And really, you know, again, we have this dysfunctional expectation that when you enter a spiritual movement, everybody should be so nice that we never have any personality conflicts. But how realistic is it? So it's again this, you have to step back and say, okay, why am I on the spiritual path in the first place? I'm on the spiritual path to grow, to raise my consciousness. So I can't let these petty, insignificant personal conflicts get in the way. In other words, you have to prioritize. What is the most important? Your spiritual growth to a higher state of consciousness. How important is it to be right in my conflict with this other person? How important is it to get my way? What is most important for you? We have to prioritize. And if you find that, as I said, if you find that your growth is more important, well, where does your growth come from? It comes from looking at your psychology, overcoming these reactionary patterns, these subconscious selves, and getting rid of them. And I've talked about this in several videos, how you do this. And so when you have that in mind, you can learn to come to recognize, here's another personality conflict. I don't want to get into any argument here. I don't want to create a spiral, because what you often see in movements, and you see that outside spiritual movements as well, people get into a conflict and they create an energetic vortex that sucks them in. It pulls on their emotional bodies. And this is what I can see happen to me when I was younger. You get pulled into this situation. You think, I have to change this. I have to speak out. This just isn't right. And you can learn to identify that. And you can say, okay, I feel the pull, I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to look at what is it in me that this energy is pulling on. And then you can come to a point where you have resolved enough of these subconscious selves that you avoid getting into these conflicts with other people. But you'll still have a period where you are not getting in direct conflict with another person. But there are two people that are in conflict. And one of them, or perhaps even both of them, are going to try to pull you in so you can take their side in the conflict. And you can also come to recognize that and say, okay, is there something in me that feels like I should be supportive of others? I should go in and try to help create peace in this situation. And then you can come to see that separate self as well. And basically the ideal, for me at least, is to come to a point where nothing is pulling on me. As Jesus said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in me. And, you know, that has been my ideal for many years. I'm not saying I fully live up to it, but I have certainly made progress compared to where I was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I see many other spiritual people who do the same thing as they mature on the path. And all I'm trying to say with this video basically is to help people avoid the disappointment where you feel like not only do you have to leave this spiritual movement, but you have to leave the spiritual path behind because it's all just a hoax, you know, and it never works. And in other words, you are letting your disappointment with other spiritual people discredit the entire spiritual path. You are throwing the baby out with the dirty bathwater. And that just doesn't lead to maximum growth. It only leads to disappointment. And I'm hoping you can avoid that disappointment. Now, just to, it's already been too long, longer than I wanted it to be, but there is another topic. There are certain people in spiritual movements who are not there because they're spiritual. But that's another topic that I'll save for another video. So I hope you can get something out of this and it can help you avoid that disappointment that I've seen many people go into.